Imagine life as a vast, echoing hall, not a place you visit once, but a space you move through every day, quietly, almost unconsciously. The walls are tall, the ceilings high, and your footsteps make a sound you stopped noticing long ago. Yet in this hall, not every sound behaves the same. Some fade immediately, others linger. Some return to you again and again, as if the room itself is remembering. Every now and then, a voice echoes louder than the rest, a tone that feels oddly recognizable, a way someone looks at you that stirs something old, a familiar emotional atmosphere, subtle, invisible, but instantly known. And before you have time to think, before logic enters the room, your attention turns toward it. It can be confusing when this happens, because sometimes the echo leads you back to people who do not treat you gently, people who feel close and distant at the same time, people who awaken longing, anxiety, or effort instead of ease. And still, something inside you says, "This feels familiar." You might ask yourself the question quietly, maybe late at night, maybe after another disappointing conversation. Why do some faces, some words, some emotional patterns feel like home, even when they bring pain? This question carries more wisdom than it seems. Many people believe that attraction should be logical, that we move toward what is good for us and away from what harms us. But human connection does not begin in logic. It begins much deeper, in the body, in the nervous system, in memory that formed long before we knew how to name it. The pattern often looks like this. You notice that the people who affect you most are not random. They may look different on the surface, live different lives, carry different stories, but emotionally, they share something familiar. The same push and pull, the same emotional temperature, the same sense that you are slightly reaching, slightly adjusting, slightly waiting. And even when it exhausts you, it feels recognizable. This is where many people turn inward with judgment. Why do I keep choosing this? Why don't I learn? What is wrong with me? But this story does not begin with something wrong. It begins with something learned. The human nervous system is not designed to seek happiness. It is designed to seek what is known well enough to survive. It remembers emotional environments the way the body remembers balance, without words, without analysis. It tracks patterns of closeness and distance, tone and withdrawal, safety and uncertainty. So when someone enters your life who recreates an old emotional atmosphere, your system recognizes it instantly, not because it is healthy, but because it is familiar. This recognition can feel like chemistry, like intuition, like fate. But often, it is memory resurfacing in the present moment. Familiarity has a powerful disguise. It does not announce itself as repetition. It arrives as comfort, as ease, as a quiet sense of "I know how to be here," even if being there requires tension, self-silencing, or effort. Because knowing how to survive somewhere can feel safer than entering a space where you do not yet know the rules. This is especially true when early connection was unpredictable. If affection came inconsistently, intensity may feel like love. If closeness required attunement to someone else's moods, emotional vigilance may feel like care. If your presence was tolerated but not fully received, partial connection may feel normal. These patterns do not disappear with age. They mature with you. They follow you quietly into adult relationships, friendships, workplaces, and emotional bonds, shaping what feels comfortable, what feels boring, and what feels unsettling. So when you feel drawn back to the wrong people, it is not because you lack self-respect. It is because your system recognizes the echo. The echo says, I have been here before. And familiarity to a nervous system often feels safer than uncertainty, even when it hurts. This is why the pull can feel so strong, almost magnetic, almost involuntary, because it is not coming from desire alone, it is coming from conditioning, from repetition, from emotional memory stored in the body, not the mind. There is no shame in this. It is not a moral failure. It is not weakness. It is not a lack of intelligence or growth. It is a human response to early emotional learning. And perhaps the most important thing to understand is this: familiarity does not mean something is good for you. It only means you know how to exist inside it. The echo in the room is not asking you to go back. It is asking you to notice, to recognize which voices feel loud because they are aligned with who you are now, and which ones are loud because they remind your system of where it learned to belong. This awareness does not demand action. It does not require immediate change. It simply invites a gentler question. What am I recognizing here? Because once you understand that familiarity is formed through emotional experience, not choice, you can begin to listen differently, not to judge the echo, but to understand where it came from. And that understanding is where this journey truly begins. Beneath the visible structure of your life, there is a blueprint. It is not something you consciously designed. You did not choose its measurements or approve its layout. In fact, for most of your life, you may not have known it existed at all. Yet it has quietly influenced how you move through relationships, how you interpret closeness, and who feels emotionally recognizable to you. This blueprint was formed early, long before preferences became opinions. Long before attraction felt romantic or deliberate. It was shaped in moments that seemed ordinary at the time. Tones of voice, emotional responses, silences, patterns of attention, the way comfort was offered, the way conflict was handled, the way love arrived or didn't. As children, we are not observers of our environment. We are participants who must adapt. We learn what keeps connection intact. We learn what disrupts it. We learn when it is safe to express needs and when it is safer to stay quiet. These lessons are not taught directly. They are absorbed, woven into the nervous system through repetition. And over time, these lessons become templates. A blueprint does not describe what is ideal. It describes what is familiar. So when you find yourself drawn to people who feel wrong for you on the surface, it is often because they fit this underlying design. They move in ways your system already understands. Their emotional availability, or lack of it, matches something you once learned how to navigate. This is why attraction can feel confusing. You may consciously want stability, kindness, presence, yet something inside you responds more strongly to distance, unpredictability, or intensity, not because those qualities are better, but because they are known. The blueprint recognizes patterns before the mind evaluates them. If early connection required effort, you may feel most alive when you are trying to earn closeness. If love was inconsistent, emotional highs and lows may register as passion. If you learn to monitor someone else's moods to stay connected, emotional vigilance may feel like intimacy. These patterns are not preferences. They are adaptations. They were shaped at a time when belonging was not optional, when connection meant survival, emotionally, and sometimes physically. And so the system learned to stay close to what it could manage, even if that closeness came with cost. This is why the past does not stay in the past. It lives on as expectation. Expectation shapes perception. Perception shapes attraction. Without realizing it, you may find yourself stepping into familiar roles again and again. The one who understands, the one who waits, the one who gives more, the one who hopes this time will be different. These roles often feel natural, almost automatic, not because they are aligned with who you are now, but because they align with who you had to be then. There is often a quiet longing beneath this repetition, not just for connection, but for completion, a hope that this familiar dynamic might finally resolve in a new way, that the person who resembles an old emotional figure might respond differently this time, that the story might end with reassurance instead of distance. This hope is deeply human. It is not a flaw. It is a form of unfinished business carried gently forward. The blueprint does not force you to repeat the past. It simply offers what it knows, and until it is seen, it operates quietly in the background, shaping what feels exciting, what feels dull, what feels threatening, and what feels like home. Understanding this does not require blame. It does not require you to label your past as good or bad. It only asks for honesty about what was consistent. Consistency, more than intensity, is what teaches the nervous system. If emotional distance was consistent, distance becomes familiar. If inconsistency was consistent, uncertainty becomes normal, and the system learns to mistake what is predictable for what is safe. This is why someone healthy can feel unfamiliar at first. Their presence may feel calm, but also strangely empty. Their consistency may feel boring. Their availability may feel suspicious, not because something is wrong, but because the blueprint has no reference for it. The absence of tension can feel like the absence of connection. This does not mean you are incapable of healthy attachment. It means your system has not yet learned to recognize it as home. Awareness begins when you start to notice these reactions, not to correct them, but to understand them. To see that attraction is not always a signal of alignment. Sometimes it is a signal of history, and history leaves traces. The blueprint of the past is not destiny, but it is influential. It shapes the first pull, the initial comfort, the sense of familiarity that precedes thought. Seeing it clearly is not about dismantling it overnight. It is about finally realizing that your choices make sense in context, that the people who felt familiar were not random. They fit a design you did not consciously choose, but learned well. And simply recognizing that design is the first moment you step out of the floorboards and into awareness, not to erase the past, but to understand how deeply it has been shaping the present. Imagine walking through a forest you have known for a long time. The path beneath your feet is narrow but clear. The ground is firm from years of use. You know where the light fades, where the trees lean closer, where the air grows still. You do not need a map here. Your body remembers every turn. This path does not lead somewhere new, but it feels easy to follow. This is how familiarity often works inside relationships. When you meet someone who fits an old emotional pattern, your nervous system recognizes the terrain immediately. There is a quiet sense of orientation. You know how to behave. You know what to expect. You know which parts of yourself to bring forward and which parts to keep hidden. That sense of knowing can feel like safety. But safety and familiarity are not the same thing. True safety allows the body to soften. Familiarity often keeps the body alert. The illusion begins when predictability is mistaken for protection. Many people stay connected to the wrong people, not because they feel deeply supported, but because they feel emotionally prepared. They know how to manage the disappointment. They know how to wait. They know how to shrink their needs to fit the available space. And that competence can feel comforting. There is relief in knowing how to survive an emotional environment, even if that environment never allows you to rest. The nervous system values predictability above all else, especially if unpredictability once carried emotional cost. So it learns to prefer what it can anticipate, even if that anticipation includes pain. This is why repetition feels grounding. You may notice that with familiar but unhealthy connections, your body rarely relaxes completely. There is often a subtle tension, monitoring tone, interpreting silence, anticipating shifts. Yet, because this state has been practiced over time, it feels normal. Belonging, by contrast, can feel unfamiliar. Belonging does not require hyper-awareness. It does not demand constant adjustment. It allows you to arrive without armor. And for someone whose system learned connection through vigilance, this can feel disorienting. Calm can feel empty. Consistency can feel suspicious. Ease can feel undeserved. So the system returns to the path it knows, not because it leads to fulfillment, but because it reduces uncertainty. The illusion of safety is subtle. It whispers, "At least I know what this is." And for a nervous system shaped by early unpredictability, that knowledge can feel reassuring, even when the outcome is loneliness inside connection. This is why walking away from familiar pain can feel more frightening than staying. Leaving means entering unmapped territory. It means giving up not only a person, but a system you have learned to navigate well. The forest path may not lead anywhere new, but stepping off it requires tolerating disorientation. And the nervous system often resists that at first. There is nothing weak about this resistance. It is protective. It is the system saying, "I know how to keep you alive here." Understanding this changes the question. Instead of asking, "Why do I stay?" you begin to ask, "What does my system believe is safer here than in the unknown?" Often the answer is not love. It is familiarity. Familiarity with emotional distance. Familiarity with inconsistency. Familiarity with effort being required for closeness. These patterns feel safe because they are expected. And expectation reduces shock, even when it does not reduce pain. True belonging does the opposite. It challenges old expectations. It invites you to receive without performing. And that invitation can feel threatening to a system trained in earning connection. So when healthier relationships feel oddly uncomfortable, it is not because something is missing. It is because something old is not being activated. No chase, no tension, no familiar ache. And without those signals, the system struggles to recognize the connection as meaningful. This does not mean you are incapable of belonging. It means your system has learned to associate intensity with connection. The illusion of safety thrives in repetition. It keeps you walking the same path, convincing you that comfort lies in what you already know. But knowing a path does not mean it leads home. Home is where the body can rest. And rest for many people is something they have not yet learned to trust. Seeing this illusion clearly is not about forcing yourself to leave familiar spaces. It is about noticing the difference between being oriented and being supported, between predictability and care, between familiarity and belonging. The forest path remains. You are not wrong for knowing it so well. But noticing that it leads nowhere new is the first quiet moment when another possibility begins to exist. And that possibility does not ask you to choose yet. It only asks you to see. Some connections do not simply reflect who you are. They reflect where you were hurt. You may notice this not in the beginning, but later, after attachment has already formed. After something familiar tightens in your chest, after old emotions surface with an intensity that feels disproportionate to the moment. It can feel confusing when this happens, because the reaction does not match the present. The disappointment feels heavier, the longing feels deeper, The fear feels older. This is often the moment when a relationship begins to act like a mirror, not a mirror that shows your current self clearly, but one that reflects old wounds that were never fully seen, named, or soothed. Unhealed pain does not disappear with time. It waits. It waits in the nervous system, in emotional memory, in the places where needs once went unmet. And when someone resembles the original source of that pain closely enough, emotionally, not logically, the wound recognizes itself. This recognition can feel powerful, almost magnetic, as if something important is happening, and in a way something is. The system senses an opportunity, not consciously, but instinctively, an opportunity to replay an old story with the hope of a different ending. This is why the wrong people can feel so significant. They touch something unfinished. They activate a question that was never answered. Will I be chosen this time? Will I finally be seen? Will I be enough here? These questions did not begin in the present relationship. They began long ago, in moments when connection was uncertain, conditional, or incomplete. The mirror works quietly. You may notice that certain behaviors affect you more than they seem to affect others. Distance feels unbearable. Silence feels personal. Inconsistency feels destabilizing. And beneath those reactions is often a younger emotional state, one that learned early how precarious connection could be. This is not regression. It is memory being activated. The body does not track time the way the mind does. When a familiar wound is touched, the nervous system responds as if it is happening again. So the pull toward the wrong people is not only about familiarity, it is also about unfinished pain seeking resolution. There is often a quiet belief underneath this pull. If I stay long enough, try hard enough, love carefully enough, maybe this time it will heal. This belief is not conscious, it is emotional, and it makes perfect sense. Healing is a human impulse. When something has been hurt, the system naturally moves toward repair. The tragedy is that it often looks for that repair in the same place where the wound first formed. So the mirror draws you back, not because you want to suffer, but because a part of you still hopes that the familiar pain might finally soften, hopes that the reflection will change, hopes that the old story might end differently. This is not self-sabotage. It is longing to be met where you once weren't, longing to be chosen without effort, longing to rest inside connection. The wrong people often cannot provide this, not because they are intentionally harmful, but because they are aligned with the wound, not the healing. They mirror what is unresolved. And mirrors do not heal wounds, they only reveal them. There is no blame here, not toward yourself, not even toward the people who trigger these patterns. Understanding this dynamic does not require assigning fault. It only requires honesty about what is being activated. When you notice that a connection repeatedly brings you back to the same emotional pain, it is not a sign that you are broken. It is a sign that something inside you is asking for attention. Pain that was once minimized, needs that were once postponed, feelings that were once managed instead of held. The mirror invites awareness. It shows you not who you should be with, but where healing is still needed. And this awareness, though uncomfortable, is profoundly compassionate because it shifts the story. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" you begin to ask, "What is still hurting?" Instead of seeing attraction as evidence of desire, you begin to see it as information. Information about where your nervous system learned to attach. Information about what still feels unresolved. This does not mean you must turn away from every mirror immediately. Awareness does not demand action. It simply asks you to stop mistaking activation for alignment, to notice that intensity is not always intimacy, that pain is not proof of connection, and that repetition is not fate. The mirror of old wounds is not cruel, it is honest. It reveals the places where love once required endurance, where connection once came with cost, and where your system learned to associate pain with closeness. Seeing this clearly does not heal the wound overnight, but it changes your relationship to it. The mirror no longer defines you, it informs you, and in that quiet shift from identification to observation, something loosens. The pull begins to make sense. The shame begins to dissolve. And for the first time, you are not inside the old story. You are looking at it. Awareness rarely arrives all at once. It does not crash through the mind like a revelation. It does not announce itself with certainty or demand immediate change. More often, it arrives the way morning does, slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed at first, like dawn. At first, nothing looks different. The landscape is the same. The shapes are familiar. But the light has shifted just enough for you to begin seeing what was always there. This is how recognition begins, not with judgment, but with a soft pause. You may notice it in a small moment. A familiar reaction arises, and instead of moving automatically, you hesitate. You feel the old pull, the old tightening, the old urge to explain, to adjust, to stay. And alongside it, something new appears. Not resistance, not resolve, but curiosity. I've been here before. That thought does not carry blame. It carries clarity. For many people, this moment is accompanied by mixed emotions. Relief, because something finally makes sense. Sadness, because the pattern has been running longer than you realized. Tenderness, because you begin to see yourself not as flawed, but as shaped. The gentle awakening is not about fixing the pattern. It is about understanding it. Understanding changes the emotional tone completely. What once felt like a personal failing begins to look like a learned response. What once inspired shame begins to evoke compassion. You start to see that your choices were never random. They were consistent with what your nervous system learned to recognize as connection. This is an important shift. Because shame keeps patterns hidden. Awareness brings them into the light. When you look back with this new light, moments from your past begin to rearrange themselves. Not to accuse, not to relive, but to explain. You notice how early you learn to adapt, how naturally you learn to manage emotional environments, how quickly you learned what parts of yourself were welcome and which required restraint. And for perhaps the first time, you feel the weight of how much effort that required. There is often grief here, not dramatic grief, but a quiet one. Grief for the ease you did not know. Grief for the safety that was conditional. Grief for the younger version of you who believed closeness had to be earned. This grief is not regression, it is integration. You are not falling apart. You are finally allowing yourself to see the full picture. The awakening also brings relief, because with understanding comes release from the endless question of what is wrong with you. The pattern stops feeling like proof of deficiency and starts feeling like evidence of survival. You stayed connected in the ways you knew how. You adapted to what was available. You learned how to belong where you could. There is no shame in that. As awareness grows, you may begin to notice the pattern as it happens, not just afterward. You feel the familiar pull toward certain dynamics, and instead of being swept away, you observe it from a slight distance. This distance is not cold, it is kind. It sounds like, of course this feels familiar, not, why am I doing this again? This change in inner language matters more than it seems, because the way you speak to yourself determines whether awareness becomes growth or another form of self-criticism. The gentle awakening does not demand perfection. It does not ask you to stop feeling attraction, longing, or hope. It simply invites honesty without punishment. You may still feel drawn to the wrong people. Awareness does not erase conditioning overnight, but it does soften its grip. It slows the reflex. It gives you a moment of choice, not necessarily to act differently, but to see clearly. And clarity changes everything. With clarity, you begin to separate who you are from what you learned. You begin to see that the pattern lives in the nervous system, not in your character, that it developed to protect connection, not to harm you. And when you see this, self-respect no longer has to fight self-understanding. They begin to exist together. This is where many people feel a quiet shift inside, a subtle reorientation, the sense that they are no longer trapped inside the pattern, even if it still appears, because now, when it shows up, it is familiar in a different way. You recognize it as history, not destiny. There is also a surprising tenderness that can emerge here, toward yourself, toward your past, even toward the versions of you that stayed too long, hoped too hard, or tried to make something work that never truly could. Instead of judgment, there is gratitude. Gratitude for the resilience it took to survive emotional uncertainty. Gratitude for the adaptability that once kept you connected. And with that gratitude comes a sense of dignity. You were not weak. You were learning. The awakening does not rush you forward. It slows you down. It creates space between stimulus and response, between attraction and attachment. In that space, something new becomes possible. Not immediately, not dramatically, but quietly. Choice begins to exist. Not the kind of choice that feels forceful or corrective, but the kind that grows naturally from understanding. You begin to notice when something feels familiar but not nourishing. You begin to sense the difference between activation and connection. And you begin to trust your awareness, even when you do not yet know what to do with it. This trust is important, because awareness without trust becomes anxiety. But awareness held with compassion becomes freedom. The gentle awakening does not mark the end of the pattern. It marks the end of believing the pattern defines you. You are no longer asleep inside it. You are awake beside it. And from that place, nothing has to be forced. Nothing has to be rushed. Understanding itself becomes the shift. The light continues to rise. And what it reveals is not failure, but clarity. There is a moment that comes after awareness. It is quiet. Nothing dramatic happens. No declaration is made. No door slams shut on the past. Instead, there is a subtle pause, a space where the old reflex no longer moves you forward automatically. This is where courage begins. Not as confidence, not as certainty, but as willingness. Willingness to stay present when the familiar pull arises, without immediately following it. Willingness to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing what comes next. Imagine a traveler standing at a crossroads. One path is well worn. The ground is smooth from repetition. The turns are predictable. The traveler knows exactly where it leads, even if the destination has never brought lasting peace. The other path is quieter, less defined. It does not promise anything. It only offers the unfamiliar. For a nervous system shaped by repetition, this second path can feel unsettling, not because it is dangerous, but because it is unpracticed. The body does not yet know how to move there with ease. Choosing differently does not mean rejecting the past. It means acknowledging that what once protected you may no longer serve you. This distinction matters because many people resist change not because they want to stay stuck, but because they do not want to betray the parts of themselves that learned how to survive. The courage to choose differently honors those parts. It does not shame them. It does not rush them. It simply recognizes that growth asks for expansion, not erasure. You may notice that when you do not follow the familiar pattern, the discomfort is immediate. There can be emptiness, restlessness, a sense of floating without direction. This is not failure. This is withdrawal from repetition. The nervous system has grown accustomed to certain emotional rhythms. When those rhythms are interrupted, there is a period of recalibration, silence where there used to be intensity, stillness where there used to be effort. Many people misinterpret this space. They believe something is missing. In truth, something old is no longer running the show. Courage here is not about forcing yourself into new connections or convincing yourself to want something different. It is about allowing the unfamiliar space to exist without immediately filling it. This is often harder than it sounds, because the familiar pattern offers a sense of identity. You know who you are there, the understanding one, the patient one, the one who stays. Stepping beyond it can feel like losing yourself, but what is actually happening is a loosening. You are no longer defined solely by adaptation, and that can feel disorienting before it feels freeing. Choosing differently is rarely loud. It often shows up as restraint, as noticing the pull and not acting on it immediately, as recognizing when attraction is rooted in history rather than presence, as allowing yourself to feel the discomfort of not engaging. This discomfort does not mean you are doing something wrong. It means you are doing something new. Growth at this stage does not look like certainty. It looks like tolerance. Tolerance for uncertainty. Tolerance for quiet. Tolerance for not being needed in the same ways. The nervous system learns through experience, not instruction. And every time you remain present without defaulting to the old path, something subtle shifts. The unfamiliar becomes slightly less threatening. The silence becomes slightly more spacious. The pause becomes slightly more trustworthy. This is how courage builds. Not through dramatic acts, but through repeated moments of staying. Staying with yourself. Staying with the discomfort, staying with the awareness that you are allowed to want something different, even if you do not yet know how it will feel. There is often fear here, fear of missing out, fear of regret, fear of ending up alone. These fears do not mean the old pattern was right. They mean the unknown has not yet been integrated. The mind may search for reasons to return to what is familiar. It may romanticize the past. It may minimize the cost. This is not deception. It is the nervous system seeking relief. Choosing differently means noticing these impulses without obeying them. It means understanding that comfort built on repetition is not the same as peace built on alignment. This distinction takes time to settle into the body, and that is okay. There is no deadline here, no finish line, only a gradual reorientation toward yourself. You may begin to sense a new internal reference point forming, not yet strong, not yet clear, but present, a sense that your worth is not dependent on being chosen, that connection does not have to be earned through endurance, that you are allowed to pause without disappearing. This emerging sense does not eliminate longing, but it changes its direction. Longing begins to point toward nourishment rather than repetition, toward reciprocity rather than pursuit, toward presence rather than intensity. The courage to choose differently is not about perfection. You may still step onto the old path sometimes. That does not erase the shift. Awareness does not demand purity. It asks for honesty. And honesty over time reshapes behavior gently from the inside out. You are not failing when choosing differently feels hard. You are recalibrating. The nervous system is learning a new language of safety, one that is quieter, one that is steadier, one that does not rely on old wounds to feel alive. This learning takes patience, and patience here is another form of courage. You are not turning away from love. You are turning toward a version of connection your system has not yet learned to trust. And that trust will not come through force. It will come through experience, through staying present in the unfamiliar long enough for it to begin feeling possible. The traveler does not need to know where the new path leads, only that continuing to walk the old one no longer feels true. That knowing is enough for now. Something subtle begins to happen after a long period of awareness and pause. It is not announced. It does not arrive with certainty or relief all at once. It emerges quietly, the way a sense of home does when you have lived somewhere long enough to stop noticing the walls. The unfamiliar begins to soften. What once felt empty now feels spacious. What once felt unsettling now feels calm. This is how a new familiar is formed, not through decision, not through force, but through repetition that no longer costs you yourself. For a long time, familiarity meant tension. It meant knowing how to wait, knowing how to endure, knowing how to stay emotionally alert. And because you practiced those states repeatedly, they came to feel normal, even comforting, even necessary. The new familiar is different. It does not rely on vigilance. It does not require you to anticipate withdrawal. It does not ask you to shrink your needs to maintain connection. At first, this difference may feel almost imperceptible. You might notice it as a lack of urgency, a conversation that does not leave you replaying it afterward, a silence that does not feel threatening, a closeness that does not require performance. These moments can feel strangely quiet, and because quiet was once associated with distance or loss, the system may hesitate, but over time, something new is learned. The body begins to register ease as safety, consistency as care, presence as connection. This learning does not happen intellectually. It happens experientially, through repeated moments where nothing goes wrong, where you are not abandoned for expressing a need, where you are not punished for taking up space, where you do not have to prove your worth to remain included. Brick by brick, a new home is built, not in a place, but in your nervous system. This home has windows. Light comes in. You can see clearly inside it. There are boundaries here, not as walls, but as structure. They do not isolate you. They hold you. In this space, connection does not feel like something you must secure. It feels like something that meets you. This does not mean every relationship is perfect. Discomfort still exists. Conflict still happens. But the difference is foundational. You no longer feel that your belonging is constantly at risk. You no longer confuse anxiety with attachment. You no longer interpret intensity as intimacy. The new familiar teaches you something profound. That peace can feel alive. That steadiness can feel meaningful. That love does not need to hurt to be real. At first, this may feel undeserved. There may be moments when you wait for the other shoe to drop, moments when your system searches for the old signals. But gradually, the absence of harm becomes evidence, and trust forms not as blind belief, but as lived experience. You begin to recognize when something feels nourishing rather than merely familiar. And this recognition is quiet. It does not rush you. It does not demand certainty. It simply feels right in the body. This is an important distinction. The old familiar pulled you forward with urgency. The new familiar invites you to stay. The old familiar asked you to adapt. The new familiar allows you to arrive. As this shift deepens, you may look back at old patterns with surprising neutrality, not longing, not bitterness, just understanding. You see clearly now why those connections felt compelling, why they felt magnetic, why they felt hard to leave. They matched the emotional language you once spoke fluently, but fluency does not mean alignment, and alignment, once felt, changes what feels like home. The new familiar is not dramatic. It will not always excite the old parts of you, but it will support your growth. It will allow you to expand instead of brace. It will feel safe enough for honesty and calm enough for rest. This is how cycles end, not through rejection of the past, but through the creation of something more fitting in the present. You did not fail because the wrong people felt familiar. They felt familiar because they matched old patterns, patterns that once made sense, patterns that once protected connection. And now, those patterns are no longer the only ones available to you. You are free to learn a new emotional language, one that does not rely on wounds to feel meaningful, one that does not confuse effort with love, one that does not require you to disappear to belong. This freedom does not arrive all at once. It grows quietly, through repeated experiences of being met, through moments of ease that no longer feel suspicious, through relationships, romantic or otherwise, that honor your nervous system instead of activating it. And over time, this new familiar begins to feel like home, not because it resembles the past, but because it supports who you are becoming. The realization settles gently. You were never broken. You were patterned, and patterns can change. You are allowed to choose what feels like home now, not based on what you survived, but based on what allows you to live fully. The echoes of the old hall may still exist, but they no longer decide where you go. You are building a new space, one gentle step at a time.